everyone and welcome back to a new video. Today I'm making a new light box of a little dragon. So lately I've been wanting to improve my light boxes because I have such cool ideas, but I feel like I can never make them as detailed or as cool as I would like, so I really wanted to try with this one. I had an idea for a sad scene. I didn't know what quite yet, so I just started sketching. I saw this video on Instagram and I used it as my inspiration because I thought it was really pretty, so I started drawing a gutter. One thing I thought I could change in my light boxes is the fact that most of them you can see the foam board on the inside, and there's nothing really wrong with that, and for some light boxes it's kind of necessary, but I thought I could try a design here where it's all covered and you don't see any foam board, and just to see how it goes. So I planned this light box with that in mind. I wanted it to look like you could be looking through a hole in the wall at the scene. And of course I wanted to add a magical element, so I brainstormed and I thought I would have a magical creature of sorts that got stuck down in the gutter and it's just looking out longing to escape, but he can't. And my first thought was a fairy, so I sketched one out with an injured wing, and I thought it would be cool to have the vegetation flourish around her and bring life into this cold environment. And she's a fairy, and fairies can do magic, and maybe it's just a thing that happens that wherever she goes there's flowers. I don't know, it was just an idea. But I wasn't completely sold on the whole fairy, so I just started on the layers and I put off the character for later. The first layer I wanted to start on was the framing layers in the very front. And I was really excited of framing the scene in some interesting ways, so I was very excited for this part. I drew a bunch of vague bricks and added vegetation like vines and little grasses here and there to add more details, and it helps blend it into the scene. Then I cut this layer out very carefully. There are a lot of thin details to cut and I hate remaking things, so I had to be very careful with this. And now that it's all cut, I can use it to plan out where the rest of the layers go. So I used this front layer to plan out the very back layer because it's easier to work back to front. And I kind of struggled trying to plan this out because I know I wanted the back wall of the gutter to have like a hole in the wall, you know, where the water flows through. And that was the easy part. I cut the hole out, and then for the brick wall I measured equal strips and cut in vertical lines for the bricks, if that makes sense, but you can kind of see how it is here. Then the difficult part is that I also need to cut out a whole top of this layer and the bottom and the sides, so it ended up looking very ugly with these little strips that connected to the sides so it doesn't completely fall apart, but it will be out of sight, so it's not really a problem. Then for this next layer I have to use my ruler because there's actually going to be a perspective in this light box, so everything on the brick walls have to be straight. And since I wanted it to look very good, I decided not to wing it, and I just used the ruler, measured everything equally, made sure everything just was really crisp and clean, and it looked good. And you can really tell that I was just figuring this out as I went, because this layer got botched a little. I realized later that I should have continued this wall on either side all the way to the bottom of the layer, but I didn't, so it ends up looking a little bit strange. But anyways, I continue with the layers, moving forward, lining up the bricks, and keeping things even and proper. On this next layer, I try to cover up those holes on the previous layer that I made, so I make the walls go all the way down from here on out. I didn't want the bricks to overlap, so there ended up being little gaps between the walls, and I was worried it would look bad, so I was a little nervous, but I just kept going and hoped they would come together in the end. As the layers kept moving forward, I started adding that grate on the ceiling that leads to the world outside. I had this cool idea of kind of having a spotlight effect, like this environment is very man-made and harsh and dark, but then where the light shines through this grate onto the character, and in the light there would be vegetation and life and beauty, so I thought it could be something cool to try to play around with. On this last layer of the ceiling, I add the rock that the character will sit on. I don't add much details here because I will do all of that later. Then I realized I wanted more in the foreground, so I created another layer like that framing layer, just slightly different and with more bricks and vegetation. And now that all these base layers are done, I decided to go and add some details in. I knew I wanted this to be a watery scene, so I got some tracing paper because it's way thinner, and I go and I glue a layer of this paper on all of the wall layers. I go about halfway up each layer, and in the end this will create a different look than the normal paper and make the water more transparent and separate it from the rest of the light box. I will end up adding a few more layers in the foreground, but for now I move on to the character. I decided I didn't like the fairy at all, because I'm not the best at drawing humans and I thought it looked lame, so I changed it to something I was more comfortable with, a little dragon. So I just started sketching and I came up with the story for this light box. So there's a family of dragons, and they went out together to hunt often. One day they went farther than usual because they couldn't find anything near their home, and as they flew it started to rain and it ended up storming. They try to find shelter in the abandoned city they're flying over, and at this point the rain is pouring so heavily that they can barely see anything in front of them. One of the dragons gets disoriented and flies into a tree, which causes his wing to be injured, and in the process he falls down and lands in the flowing water. As he struggles to stay afloat, he gets washed into the gutter where he manages to grab onto a rock and pull himself out of the water. But it's wet and dark and lonely, and he calls out to his family, but they can't hear him over the pouring rain, and all he can do is wait and watch his family leave, not realizing he got left behind. So that's the story I came up with, and it's kind of sad, but it kind of captures the feel I wanted for this light box. And so for this little dragon, I try to give him a sad look in his eyes because he was sad. But yeah, for the dragon, I put certain elements like his wings and legs on separate pieces of paper and use spacers to add depth. This is always my favorite part. I find creating these little creatures with lots of different pieces of paper super fun to make. It's like putting together a little puzzle, which I love puzzles. I added the tracing paper onto the wings to make them more interesting and kind of see-through. This is also where I showed the broken, tattered wing. Then once I assembled the dragon, I move on to adding more details. I thought the brick walls could use some texture because they look pretty boring right now, so I cut some random shapes out of sketching paper and cardstock, and I glue them in various places all over the walls to act as moss or some texture on the rocks. I also took this opportunity to try to cover a few of those awkward gaps between some bricks. Now moving on to the foreground, I add some more water layers to create a more open area in the front, so I just do that real quick. And now it's time for the fun part, adding all the vegetation. I was really excited because I plan to have some plants under the water, and as you can see through the tracing paper, it would add lots of depth and you could see those plants and maybe even a fish or two hidden like in the water, and I thought that could be really cool. So I create some grass clumps, flowers, vines, and a few little critters. I make 2 fish to swim in the water and then a couple little bugs to place around here and there. Then I start gluing them around everywhere. I glue some around the rock and I place the dragon in its place as well. Then I just keep going and I place them around wherever they look good. I glue the fish into the water and I keep building up all the vegetation. This part was actually so annoying because I couldn't see things well by laying the layers down on my table, so I kind of stood them up against my tripod, but then they kept slipping and falling, which was so frustrating, but I managed to glue everything in place nonetheless. Then for even more details, I wanted to add ripples to the water with sketching paper because it's thicker than tracing paper, but not as thick as cardstock, so it would be kind of an in-between, and it would just add further detail to the water, and I was really happy with this decision. And finally, I have to plan out that last layer to cover the hole in the back of the tunnel and the sky. I just create a brick wall texture to cover that gap. I didn't do a full layer here because I only wanted this layer to cover behind the walls but not under the water or the sky, so this strip was the easiest way to accomplish that. Then I take some tracing paper to cover up the sky, and I also draw and cut out the little dragon's family. I didn't bother to add lots of details to them because they're supposed to be small, flying away in the distance. Then I just plan out where they go and I glue them in their places. Then I decided to attach the sky and that back wall layer because why not? So I did that, and now it's time to assemble. I take some foam board and I cut 1/2-inch strips and I start gluing the layers together. It's always so cool seeing everything come together, and especially with this light box because it's one of my favorites. And then I made this super fancy box to put it in, so I just gently slide all the papers in there. And for the LEDs, I got these ones from Walmart that have a remote so I can change the light, which I just stick in the back and I attach the back panel. And this is how it looks. I think it looks super cool. And here it is with the LEDs turned on, and I absolutely love it. I really like that it looks more organic and not so boxy with the layers, and this purple color captured that feeling I really wanted. Overall, it's definitely one of my favorites. So yeah, let me know what you think down below, and if you enjoyed, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!